In the small town of Millbrook, where everyone knows everyone, and secrets are harder to keep than promises, there lived a truth so powerful it would shake the very foundation of what it means to belong. This is not just another story about military service or forgotten heroes. This is about Sarah Chen, a woman whose name never appeared on any official roster, whose sacrifice went unrecorded in history books, and whose courage was buried under layers of bureaucratic silence for over 60 years. What happens when someone gives everything for their country, only to discover their country has no record of their existence? What happens when the very system meant to honor heroes becomes the barrier to recognition? And most importantly, what happens when one person's fight for acknowledgement becomes a community's awakening to the hidden stories that surround us all? Sarah's story will challenge everything you think you know about service, sacrifice, and the price of being forgotten. It will take you from the battlefields of Korea to the quiet streets of suburban America, from dusty government archives to the heart of a family torn apart by decades of silence. This is a story about the power of persistence, the weight of truth, and the extraordinary lengths one person will go to ensure that no hero is ever truly left behind. The woman who was missing from every roster was about to remind the world that some battles are worth fighting long after the war has ended. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Veterans Affairs office in downtown Springfield as Margaret Chen walked through the glass doors for the 7th time in 3 months. Her weathered hands clutched a manila folder filled with documents, photographs, and letters that told a story the government insisted never happened. At 78 years old, Margaret had spent the last 5 years of her life trying to prove something that should have been simple. Her mother, Sarah Chen, had served her country during the Korean War. The receptionist, a kind woman named Linda who had grown to recognize Margaret's determined stride, looked up with a sympathetic smile. "Mrs. Chen, Mr. Rodriguez is ready to see you now." Margaret nodded, straightening her shoulders as she prepared for another battle in a war that had been raging far longer than the conflict her mother had fought in over 6 decades ago. Sarah Chen had been born in 1925 in San Francisco's Chinatown, the daughter of Chinese immigrants who had come to America seeking the promise of a better life. Her father, Wei Chen, worked 16-hour days in a textile factory, while her mother, Li Mei, took in sewing to help make ends meet. Sarah grew up speaking both Mandarin and English fluently, a skill that would later prove invaluable in ways the family could never have imagined. When the Korean War began in 1950, Sarah was 25 years old and working as a translator for the Immigration and Naturalization Service in San Francisco. She had always been drawn to service, volunteering at local community centers and helping new immigrants navigate the complex bureaucracy of American life. Her facility with languages had expanded beyond Chinese and English to include Korean, which she had learned from refugees who had fled to San Francisco's Chinatown in the years leading up to the war. The recruiter who approached Sarah in the spring of 1951 was not wearing a military uniform. Captain James Mitchell was a tall, serious man who worked for what he described only as special operations. He had sought Sarah out specifically because of her language skills and her clean background check. The meeting took place in a small cafe in Chinatown, away from the prying eyes of the immigration office where Sarah worked. "Miss Chen," Captain Mitchell had said, stirring his coffee slowly, "your country needs people like you, people who can bridge cultures and communicate when others cannot. What I'm about to tell you must remain confidential, but there are operations in Korea that require civilian contractors with your specific skill set." Sarah had listened intently as Captain Mitchell explained that she would be working as a translator and cultural liaison, helping American forces communicate with Korean civilians and refugees. The work would be dangerous, he warned, and it would require her to spend extended periods in active combat zones. Most importantly, he emphasized, her role would be classified, and she would be working under civilian contractor status rather than as an enlisted member of the military. "Why not just enlist me properly?" Sarah had asked, her practical nature questioning the unusual arrangement. Captain Mitchell had paused, choosing his words carefully. "The nature of this work requires flexibility that traditional military structure doesn't allow. You'll be working with intelligence units, refugee operations, and diplomatic missions. Civilian contractor status gives us the ability to move you where you're needed most, without the red tape of military transfers. The pay was substantial, nearly 3 times what Sarah was making at the immigration office. More importantly, the work aligned with her sense of duty and her desire to help people caught in the crossfire of war. She accepted the position that same afternoon, signing papers that would later prove to be both her authorization to serve and her ticket to decades of bureaucratic limbo. Within 2 weeks, Sarah found herself on a military transport plane headed for Seoul, South Korea. The other passengers were a mix of military personnel and civilian contractors, though the distinction seemed to blur once they were in the air. Sarah spent the long flight studying intelligence briefings and cultural guides, preparing for a role that would put her at the center of some of the war's most crucial operations. Her first assignment was at a refugee processing center just outside of Seoul, where thousands of Korean civilians fled daily from the advancing Chinese forces. Sarah's job was to interview refugees, gathering intelligence about enemy positions, while also helping to identify family members and coordinate humanitarian aid. The work was emotionally draining and physically dangerous, as the processing center came under artillery fire several times during her first month there. What struck Sarah most about the work was how essential it was, and how invisible she seemed to be in the official records. While the military personnel around her had clear ranks, unit assignments, and documentation of their service, Sarah's work seemed to exist in a shadow world of classified operations and unmarked files. Her paychecks came from a civilian contractor firm, but her orders came from military intelligence officers. Her living quarters were in military barracks, but her name never appeared on any unit roster. As the months passed, Sarah's role expanded beyond translation work. Her understanding of Korean culture and her ability to build trust with traumatized refugees made her invaluable to intelligence-gathering operations. She began accompanying special operations teams on missions to gather information from villages near the front lines, often serving as the crucial link between American forces and Korean civilians who possessed vital intelligence. The danger of these missions became real to Sarah during her 4th month in Korea. She was accompanying a reconnaissance team to a village that had recently been liberated from Chinese forces when they came under heavy enemy fire. Sarah found herself pinned down behind a stone wall with 3 Marines, using her radio skills to coordinate air support while simultaneously translating for a Korean family hiding in a nearby building. The family had information about Chinese troop movements, but they were too terrified to speak to the American soldiers directly. Sarah spent nearly 2 hours under fire, crawling between positions to gather intelligence that would later prove crucial to preventing a major Chinese assault on Allied positions. Her actions that day saved not only the lives of the Marines she was with, but potentially hundreds of soldiers who would have been caught unprepared by the enemy attack. Despite the significance of her contributions, Sarah noticed that her actions were never formally recognized. While the Marines she served with were recommended for commendations, her role in the mission was mentioned only obliquely in classified reports that would remain buried in intelligence files for decades. This pattern continued throughout Sarah's 18 months of service in Korea. She participated in dozens of intelligence-gathering missions, helped process thousands of refugees, and provided crucial translation services that saved lives and gathered vital military intelligence. Yet her contributions seemed to exist in an official void, documented in classified files, but absent from the formal military records that would typically acknowledge such service. The end of Sarah's service came abruptly in early 1953 as armistice negotiations began in earnest. Captain Mitchell, who had recruited her nearly 2 years earlier, appeared at her quarters one morning with new orders. She was being reassigned to work with the Armistice Commission, helping to facilitate communication between American negotiators and their Korean counterparts. "This is the most important work you'll do here," Mitchell told her as they walked through the war-torn streets of Seoul. "Getting this armistice right will determine the future of this peninsula. Your skills could be the difference between lasting peace and renewed conflict." Sarah threw herself into the armistice work with the same dedication she had shown throughout her service. She worked 18-hour days, translating complex diplomatic language and helping to navigate the cultural nuances that could make or break delicate negotiations. Her work was so valued that she was one of the last civilian contractors to leave Korea after the armistice was signed in July 1953. When Sarah finally returned to San Francisco in late 1953, She carried with her a chest full of memories, a handful of photographs, and a folder of documents that proved her service. She also carried something else: the assumption that her sacrifice and contribution would be recognized and honored, like any other veteran service. That assumption would prove to be tragically wrong. When Sarah applied for veterans benefits in 1954, she was told that there was no record of her service. The civilian contractor firm that had paid her salary had dissolved, and the military units she had served with had no documentation of her participation in their missions. According to the Veterans Administration, Sarah Chen had never served her country in Korea. Sarah spent months trying to navigate the bureaucracy, writing letters to former colleagues and searching for someone who could verify her service. But the classified nature of much of her work meant that many of the people she had served with were unable to speak openly about missions that remained secret. Others had moved on with their lives, scattered across the country and difficult to track down in an era before the internet made such searches simple. Eventually, Sarah gave up the fight. She returned to her work as a translator, married a fellow veteran named Robert Chen in 1956, and settled into civilian life. She rarely spoke about her time in Korea, partly because much of what she had done remained classified, and partly because the pain of having her service denied had never fully healed. Sarah raised 3 children and lived a quiet life in the suburbs of San Francisco. She volunteered with veterans organizations despite not being officially recognized as a veteran herself, and she instilled in her children a deep respect for service and sacrifice. Her daughter Margaret grew up hearing fragments of stories about her mother's time in Korea, but it wasn't until Sarah was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 2010 that the full scope of her service became clear. As Margaret helped her mother organize her papers and prepare for the difficult progression of the disease, she discovered the folder of documents Sarah had kept for nearly 60 years. Inside were photographs of Sarah in Korea, letters from commanding officers praising her work, and copies of intelligence reports that bore her signature. There were also personal letters Sarah had written to her parents, describing her experiences in Korea and her pride in serving her country. The discovery prompted Margaret to begin her own investigation into her mother's service. What she found was a bureaucratic maze that seemed designed to forget rather than remember. Military records had been destroyed in fires, civilian contractor firms had disappeared without a trace, and the classified nature of much of Sarah's work meant that official acknowledgement would require declassification processes that could take decades. But Margaret also found something else: evidence that her mother's story was not unique. As she dug deeper into the history of civilian contractors in Korea, she discovered that hundreds of people had served in similar capacities, their contributions lost to history because they fell between the cracks of military and civilian record-keeping systems. Sarah Chen passed away in 2015, 5 years before her daughter's fight for recognition would finally gain traction. Margaret stood at her mother's funeral, looking at a flag that had been provided by the local American Legion post rather than the U.S. military, and made a promise that would consume the next decade of her life. Her mother would not be forgotten. Her service would be recognized, and if it took the rest of Margaret's life, she would ensure that Sarah Chen's name would finally appear on the roster of American heroes where it had always belonged. The fight for recognition was just beginning, and Margaret Chen was about to discover that some battles are inherited from one generation to the next, carrying forward until justice is finally served. Margaret Chen's transformation from dutiful daughter to determined advocate began with a single phone call in January 2016. She had been sitting in her mother's empty house surrounded by boxes of belongings that needed sorting when she decided to call the Veterans Affairs office one more time. This time, however, she wasn't calling to ask for help. She was calling to serve notice that she would not give up until her mother's service was officially recognized. The representative who answered, a patient man named David Hernandez, listened as Margaret explained her situation for what felt like the 100th time. But this conversation was different. Margaret had spent months researching similar cases, studying the bureaucratic processes that had failed her mother, and preparing a methodical approach to what she now understood was a systemic problem. "Mr. Hernandez," Margaret said, her voice steady with newfound resolve, "I'm not calling to ask you to find my mother's records. I'm calling to inform you that I'm going to find them myself, and when I do, I expect the Veterans Administration to honor them." The research that followed consumed Margaret's life in ways she had never expected. She started by contacting the National Archives, hoping to find some trace of her mother's service in the vast collection of military documents housed in College Park, Maryland. What she discovered was both encouraging and frustrating. There were indeed records of civilian contractors serving in Korea, but accessing them required navigating a complex web of classification levels, privacy restrictions, and bureaucratic procedures that seemed designed to discourage all but the most persistent researchers. Margaret's first breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a Korean War veterans newsletter that she found at her local library. In the newsletter was an article about the challenges faced by civilian contractors seeking recognition for their service. The article mentioned a researcher named Dr. Patricia Williams, a military historian at Georgetown University who had been studying the role of civilian contractors in the Korean War. When Margaret called Dr. Williams, she found herself speaking with someone who understood both the historical significance of her mother's service and the bureaucratic obstacles that had prevented its recognition. Dr. Williams had been documenting similar cases for years, building a database of civilian contractors whose contributions to the war effort had been overlooked or forgotten. "Your mother's story fits a pattern I've seen dozens of times," Dr. Williams explained during their first phone conversation. The military relied heavily on civilian contractors for specialized skills, particularly language capabilities, but the record-keeping systems weren't designed to properly document their service. Many of these people served with distinction, but because they fell between military and civilian categories, their contributions were lost. Dr. Williams agreed to help Margaret research her mother's case, and together they began the painstaking process of reconstructing Sarah's service record. They started with the documents Sarah had saved, using names, dates, and unit designations to search for corroborating evidence in military archives, intelligence files, and congressional records. The search led them down paths Margaret had never imagined exploring. They found references to Sarah's work in declassified CIA documents related to refugee operations in Korea. They discovered her name in the daily reports of military intelligence units that had relied on her translation services. Most significantly, they found evidence that Sarah's information-gathering work had contributed to several major intelligence coups that had shaped the course of the war. One document, declassified in 2010, but buried in thousands of pages of intelligence files, specifically mentioned Sarah by name in connection with intelligence that prevented a major Chinese assault on Seoul in early 1952. The document, written by a military intelligence officer, praised civilian contractor S. Chen for her exceptional courage and invaluable linguistic skills in obtaining crucial intelligence under enemy fire. Armed with this growing body of evidence, Margaret returned to the Veterans Affairs Office in Springfield, but this time she wasn't alone. Dr. Coratime Williams accompanied her, bringing academic credibility to Margaret's claims. They also brought with them a local television reporter named Jessica Martinez, who had become interested in the story after Margaret contacted the station's investigative team. The meeting with VA officials was unlike any Margaret had experienced before. Instead of being told that no records existed, she was now presenting evidence that records did exist but had been overlooked or misclassified. The officials, faced with documented proof of Sarah's service, agreed to initiate a formal review process that could potentially lead to official recognition. But the review process, Margaret soon learned, was just the beginning of a new set of challenges. The VA's procedures for recognizing previously undocumented service were cumbersome and slow, requiring multiple levels of approval and extensive verification of evidence. The process could take years, and success was far from guaranteed. Margaret's frustration with the slow pace of official channels led her to explore alternative approaches. She began reaching out to veterans organizations, hoping to find allies who could help pressure the system to move more quickly. Her efforts caught the attention of the American Legion Post in her hometown, whose members were outraged to learn that a fellow veteran had been denied recognition for over 60 years. The Legion Post commander, a Vietnam veteran named Tom Rodriguez, made Sarah's case a priority for his organization. He organized letter-writing campaigns to congressional representatives, arranged for local media coverage, and most importantly, connected Margaret with other families facing similar struggles. Through these connections, Margaret discovered that her mother's case was part of a much larger problem affecting hundreds of Korean War veterans. As Margaret's advocacy work expanded, she found herself becoming a spokesperson for a forgotten generation of service members. She began speaking at veterans' events, sharing her mother's story and highlighting the broader issues of bureaucratic neglect that had left so many heroes unrecognized. Her presentations were powerful not just because of the injustice they revealed, but because of the dignity and determination with which Margaret approached her mission. The media attention that surrounded Margaret's efforts began to generate political interest in the case. Congressman Michael Chen, no relation to Margaret's family, despite the shared surname, took up the cause after seeing a news report about Sarah's story. As a member of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, Congressman Chen had the influence to push for faster action on the bureaucratic review process. Working with Dr. Williams, Congressman Chen's office compiled a comprehensive dossier on Sarah's service that included not only the evidence Margaret had gathered, but also testimony from surviving veterans who remembered working with Sarah in Korea. One of these veterans, a former Marine intelligence officer named Colonel Robert Hayes, provided particularly compelling testimony about Sarah's contributions to several high-risk missions. Sarah Chen saved my life and the lives of my Marines on at least 3 occasions that I can document, Colonel Hayes wrote in his statement to the Congressional Committee. Her courage under fire and her ability to communicate with Korean civilians provided intelligence that prevented enemy ambushes and saved American lives. The fact that her service has gone unrecognized is a disgrace to every principle our military claims to uphold. As the evidence mounted and political pressure increased, the Veterans Affairs Department began to take Margaret's case more seriously. A special review board was convened to examine not only Sarah's case, but also the broader issue of unrecognized civilian contractor service during the Korean War. The board's work would eventually lead to policy changes that would help other families facing similar struggles. But for Margaret, the focus remained on one goal: getting her mother's name added to the official roster of Korean War veterans. The breakthrough came in the form of a previously classified document that Dr. Williams discovered in the State Department archives. The document was a commendation letter written by a high-ranking diplomatic official who had worked with Sarah during the armistice negotiations. The letter, written in 1953 but classified for national security reasons, explicitly recommended Sarah for official recognition of her extraordinary service to the United States of America in support of military operations in Korea. The existence of this letter, written by a government official, and specifically recommending recognition for military service, provided the legal foundation needed to override the bureaucratic obstacles that had blocked Sarah's case for decades. When the letter was presented to the VA Review Board, it created an undeniable link between Sarah's work and official military service recognition. But even with this compelling evidence, the process moved slowly. Margaret spent months traveling between government offices in Washington, D.C., attending hearings, providing testimony, and answering questions from officials who seemed more concerned with covering their department's past mistakes than with correcting them. The emotional toll of the process was enormous, as Margaret found herself reliving her mother's experiences and fighting battles that Sarah herself had been too exhausted to continue. The support Margaret received from the veterans community sustained her through the most difficult periods of the process. Veterans from across the country began reaching out to share their own stories of bureaucratic neglect and to offer encouragement for her fight. Many of these veterans had served alongside civilian contractors like Sarah and remembered their contributions even if the official records did not. One letter that particularly moved Margaret came from a Korean War veteran named James Patterson, who had served as a communications specialist with the unit that had worked most closely with Sarah. Patterson's letter included specific details about missions he and Sarah had participated in together, providing yet another piece of evidence to support her case. "I want you to know that your mother was a hero in every sense of the word," Patterson wrote. "She risked her life for people she didn't know in a country far from home because she believed it was right. The fact that bureaucrats lost track of her paperwork doesn't change what she did or diminish her sacrifice. I'm proud to have served alongside her, and I'm ashamed that it took this long for her service to be recognized." As Margaret's case gained national attention, it began to attract support from unexpected quarters. Korean-American organizations embraced Sarah's story as an example of the often overlooked contributions that Asian Americans had made to American military efforts. Civil rights groups saw the case as an example of how bureaucratic systems could fail minority communities, even when those communities had served with distinction. The intersection of Sarah's story with broader social and political issues gave Margaret's advocacy work a platform that extended far beyond the Veterans Affairs Department. She found herself testifying before congressional committees, speaking at academic conferences, and participating in documentary films about the Korean War. Each appearance was an opportunity to tell her mother's story and to push for the recognition that had been denied for so long. The media attention also brought unexpected personal rewards for Margaret. She began hearing from people who had known her mother during the war, including Korean civilians who remembered Sarah's kindness during the most difficult periods of their lives. These connections helped Margaret understand not just what her mother had done, but who she had been during those crucial years in Korea. One particularly moving contact came from a woman named Park Min-jung, who had been a child refugee when Sarah helped her family reunite after being separated during the Chinese offensive in 1951. Park, now living in Los Angeles, had spent decades wondering what had happened to the kind American woman who had helped her find her father. When she saw Margaret's story on the news, she immediately reached out to express her gratitude for Sarah's service. "Your mother gave me back my family," Park told Margaret during an emotional phone conversation. "I have lived my whole life in America because of her kindness. She deserves every honor this country can give her." By late 2018, the combination of overwhelming evidence, political pressure, and media attention had created a situation that the Veterans Affairs Department could no longer ignore. The review board completed its investigation and recommended that Sarah Chen be officially recognized as a Korean War veteran, with full eligibility for veterans' benefits and honors. The formal announcement came on a cold December morning in 2018, nearly 3 years after Margaret had begun her intensive advocacy campaign. Standing in the same VA office where she had been told repeatedly that no records existed, Margaret listened as officials announced that Sarah Chen's service had been officially recognized and that she would be posthumously awarded the Korean Service Medal, the United Nations Service Medal, and the Combat Action Badge. The moment was bittersweet for Margaret. The recognition she had fought so hard to achieve had finally come, but it had come too late for her mother to witness it. Sarah had died believing that her service had been forgotten, never knowing that her daughter would spend years ensuring that her sacrifice would be remembered. The flag presentation ceremony took place on a bright Saturday morning in May 2019 at the Golden Gate National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. Margaret stood beside her mother's grave as a Marine honor guard carefully folded the American flag that had been draped over a symbolic casket representing Sarah's service. The ceremony had drawn hundreds of people, family members, veterans, government officials, and complete strangers who had been moved by Sarah's story and wanted to witness this long-overdue recognition. As the Marine sergeant placed the folded flag in Margaret's hands and spoke the traditional words of gratitude for Sarah's service, Margaret felt a mixture of triumph and profound sadness. The flag was beautiful, the ceremony was dignified, and the recognition was complete. But the person who had earned this honor was not there to receive it, and that absence cast a shadow over what should have been a moment of pure celebration. The ceremony was covered by local and national media, and the story of Sarah Chen's delayed recognition became a symbol of both bureaucratic failure and the power of persistent advocacy. But for Margaret, the public attention was less important than the private moment she had shared with her mother's memory during the flag-folding ceremony. In that moment, she felt that she had finally kept the promise she had made at her mother's funeral 4 years earlier. The impact of Sarah's official recognition extended far beyond her individual case. The research that Dr. Williams and Margaret had conducted during their investigation had revealed dozens of similar cases of unrecognized civilian contractors from the Korean War. The evidence they had compiled became the foundation for a broader initiative to identify and honor other forgotten veterans from this category of service. Congressman Chen used Sarah's case as the cornerstone for legislation that would streamline the process for recognizing previously undocumented military service. The Sarah Chen Korean War Civilian Contractor Recognition Act, introduced in Congress in late 2019, established new procedures for reviewing cases like Sarah's, and provided funding for research initiatives to identify other veterans whose service had been overlooked. The legislation faced some initial resistance from Veterans Affairs officials who were concerned about the administrative burden of reviewing potentially hundreds of historical cases. But the compelling nature of Sarah's story, combined with the political momentum that Margaret's advocacy had generated, made opposition to the bill politically difficult. The act passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support and was signed into law in early 2020. Margaret's role in these broader policy changes transformed her from a grieving daughter seeking recognition for her mother into a national advocate for veterans' rights. She was invited to serve on advisory committees, speak at veterans' conferences, and consult with other families facing similar struggles. While she never sought this public role, Margaret embraced it as a way to honor her mother's memory and ensure that other families wouldn't have to endure the same decades-long fight for recognition. One of the most rewarding aspects of Margaret's advocacy work was the opportunity to help other families navigate the bureaucratic maze that had nearly defeated her own efforts. She developed a network of researchers, historians, and legal advocates who could provide support for families seeking recognition for undocumented service. This informal network eventually evolved into a formal nonprofit organization called the Forgotten Veterans Project, which Margaret founded in 2020. The Forgotten Veterans Project used the research methods and legal strategies that had proven successful in Sarah's case to assist other families facing similar challenges. Within its first year, the organization had helped secure recognition for 12 previously undocumented Korean War veterans and had identified dozens of other cases that were working their way through the new streamlined process established by the Sarah Chen Act. Each success story was meaningful to Margaret, but some cases resonated with her in particularly personal ways. One such case involved Maria Rodriguez, whose father had served as a medical translator during the Korean War, but had never received recognition for his service. Like Sarah, Roberto Rodriguez had been a civilian contractor whose language skills had made him invaluable to military medical units treating wounded Korean civilians. Working with Maria Rodriguez reminded Margaret of her own journey and reinforced her understanding of how bureaucratic neglect had affected entire communities of veterans. The Korean War had relied heavily on specialists, like interpreters, cultural liaisons, and technical experts who often served under civilian contractor status. Many of these individuals had risked their lives and made significant contributions to the war effort, but the record-keeping systems of the 1950s had not been designed to properly document their service. The work of identifying and honoring these forgotten veterans took on greater urgency as the Korean War generation aged. By 2020, most veterans of that conflict were in their 80s or 90s, and many had already passed away without receiving recognition for their service. Margaret realized that her mother's case had been part of a race against time to honor a generation of heroes before they were all gone. This sense of urgency drove Margaret to expand her advocacy beyond individual cases to address the systemic issues that had created the problem in the first place. She began working with military historians and government officials to develop better record-keeping systems that would prevent future generations of veterans from facing the same struggles. Her recommendations, based on the painful lessons learned from her mother's case, were incorporated into military policies governing civilian contractor documentation. The personal cost of Margaret's advocacy work was substantial. She had essentially put her own life on hold for 5 years while pursuing recognition for her mother's service. Her career as a high school teacher had suffered as she took extended leaves of absence to travel to Washington, D.C. for hearings and meetings. Her personal relationships had been strained by the single-minded focus that the advocacy work required. But Margaret had also found unexpected rewards in the work. The connection she had made with other veterans' families had created a community of support that sustained her through the most difficult periods of the process. The veterans who had reached out to share their memories of her mother had given Margaret a deeper understanding of who Sarah had been as a young woman, filling in gaps in family history that had existed for decades. One of the most meaningful connections was with Colonel Hayes, the former Marine intelligence officer who had provided testimony supporting Sarah's case. Hayes and Margaret developed a friendship based on their shared commitment to honoring her mother's memory, and Hayes became a mentor figure for Margaret as she navigated the complex world of veterans advocacy. Through Hayes, Margaret learned details about her mother's service that had never been part of family stories. She learned that Sarah had volunteered for the most dangerous missions, often serving as the only woman in combat zones where her presence was both crucial and vulnerable. She learned that Sarah had earned the respect of hardened combat veterans who had initially been skeptical of working with a civilian contractor. "Your mother had more courage than most soldiers I knew," Hayes told Margaret during one of their conversations. "She walked into situations that would have terrified trained Marines, and she did it with a smile on her face because she knew people needed her help. The men I served with would have followed her anywhere because they knew she would never let them down." These insights into her mother's character helped Margaret understand not just what Sarah had done during the war, but why she had never complained about the lack of recognition afterward. Sarah's service had been motivated by a desire to help people, not by a need for official acknowledgement. The satisfaction of knowing she had made a difference had been more important to her than medals or ceremonies. This understanding influenced how Margaret approached the ongoing work of the Forgotten Veterans Project. While official recognition was important and necessary, she realized that the deeper goal was to ensure that the stories and contributions of these veterans were remembered and honored by their communities, regardless of their official status. The project began collecting oral histories from family members of forgotten veterans, creating a digital archive that preserved not just the facts of their service, but the personal stories that official documents could never capture. These oral histories became a valuable resource for researchers studying the Korean War and provided comfort for families who had struggled with the same sense of invisibility that Margaret had experienced. By 2021, the combination of policy changes, media attention, and grassroots advocacy had fundamentally changed how cases like Sarah's were handled by the Veterans Affairs Department. The new processes established by the Sarah Chen Act had reduced the time required for recognition from years to months, and the burden of proof had shifted from families to government agencies that were now required to actively search for evidence of service. The success of these changes was demonstrated by the steady stream of recognition ceremonies taking place across the country, as previously forgotten veterans received the honors they had earned decades earlier. Each ceremony was a celebration not just of individual service, but of the power of persistent advocacy to correct historical injustices. Margaret attended many of these ceremonies, often serving as a speaker who could help families understand the significance of the recognition their loved ones were receiving. Her presence at these events created a sense of continuity and community among families who had shared similar struggles, and her story served as proof that even the most daunting bureaucratic obstacles could be overcome. One ceremony that held particular meaning for Margaret was the recognition of Park Min-jung's brother, who had served as a translator with American forces, after being helped by Sarah as a refugee child. The family connection that had developed between Margaret and the Park family created a symbolic link between Sarah's wartime service and its lasting impact on the people she had helped. As Margaret stood at the ceremony honoring Park's brother, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. What had begun as a daughter's desire to honor her mother's memory had evolved into a national movement to recognize forgotten veterans and reform bureaucratic systems that had failed them. The personal had become political, and the political had become deeply personal. The legacy of Sarah Chen's delayed recognition continues to influence veterans' advocacy and military policy. The research methods developed during Margaret's campaign have become standard practice for families seeking recognition for undocumented service. The Sarah Chen Act has facilitated the recognition of hundreds of previously forgotten veterans, ensuring that their contributions to American military history are finally acknowledged. Margaret's work has also inspired a new generation of advocates who understand that bureaucratic systems require constant vigilance to prevent institutional forgetting. The Forgotten Veterans Project has become a model for how civilian organizations can work with government agencies to identify and correct historical oversights. Perhaps most importantly, Sarah Chen's story has become a reminder that heroism often exists in forms that official systems fail to recognize or record. The translators, medics, and specialists who serve alongside combat forces may not wear the same uniforms or follow the same career paths, but their contributions are no less valuable or deserving of recognition. Today, Sarah Chen's name appears on the roster at the Korean War Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., etched in granite, alongside thousands of other names representing American service in that conflict. Visitors to the memorial can find her name and know that she served with honor, even though that service remained hidden for over 60 years. Margaret continues her advocacy work, knowing that there are still forgotten veterans whose stories remain buried in classified files and overlooked archives. Each case she helps resolve is another victory against the institutional forgetting that once threatened to erase her mother's legacy entirely. The promise Margaret made at her mother's funeral has been kept. Sarah Chen is no longer missing from the roster, and her service to her country is finally, officially, and permanently recognized. But perhaps more importantly, her story has become a testament to the power of love, persistence, and the unshakable belief that no hero should ever be left behind. In the end, Sarah Chen's greatest victory was not in receiving recognition for her own service, but in inspiring a movement that ensures future generations of veterans will not face the same struggle for acknowledgement. Her legacy lives not just in the medals and ceremonies that finally honored her contributions, but in the systemic changes that will prevent other families from enduring decades of bureaucratic neglect. The woman who was missing from the roster has become the catalyst for ensuring that no veteran is ever forgotten again. And in that transformation, both Sarah and Margaret Chen have found a victory that transcends any individual recognition, creating a lasting impact that will honor veterans for generations to come.